Welcome to this video on error correction. Students need to know what mistakes they're making and why. Simply telling a student that they are correct or incorrect is not enough. They need to be shown how to fix the problem. Without constructive feedback, a great activity can have very little value to your learners. Let's look at a few ideas today. One of the main dilemmas for teachers is error correction. It's always tricky to know when and if to correct your students and how to go about it. A huge problem is the perception by both teachers and students that errors are bad, and this comes from decades of behaviourist teaching that we must avoid mistakes. But look, if we never experiment with language, how will we ever use new language? The first thing to do is start a class mindset that mistakes are good. Make a few mistakes yourself to set a good example. Some students avoid making mistakes for reasons of culture. The whole concept of losing face with some Asian students is definitely something to be sensitive to. But in my experience, once students realise that class is a safe place where no one will laugh if they make an error, they're going to take more risks. So what sort of errors are there? There are errors that appear because the student is guessing. The rules haven't been looked at and she is attempting something above her level. Typically, very low-level students, when trying to talk about the past, use the present simple, with past time references. For example, yesterday I go to the cinema. This is risk-taking, and it's certainly something we want our students to attempt. There's errors where the student has got the wrong end of the stick. There is a rule, but they've used the wrong rule. The student can justify their choice and the teacher can see why it's happening. And this is good that the student is using a process to arrive at the answer. So give plenty of praise. Say, I can understand why you gave that answer. Well done. It's not the correct answer. Let's find the correct answer together as a class, but well done. Then there's errors that come about in fluency practice. And when you point out to the student that there is a problem, the student is able to self-correct. It hasn't become part of the automatic arsenal of language at the student's disposal. Now, what sort of errors are there? There are lexical errors, errors with vocabulary, or phonological errors, errors with pronunciation. Syntactic error, this is a grammar error. Interpretive errors, misunderstanding of a speaker's intention or the meaning. And a pragmatic error, which is failure to apply the rules of conversation. For example, turn-taking. So how much should the teacher correct? Before you begin an activity, bear in mind whether you are concentrating on accuracy or fluency. For a class discussion, for example, fluency would be appropriate. The important thing is that the students are expressing themselves and thinking on their feet. However, if students have had time to prepare a role play and then they're going to perform it, you may want to encourage accuracy. Be clear about the aims of the task and make sure the students are aware what you expect from them. Don't present an activity as a fluency task and then pick them up on every single mistake. After a role play, consider correcting only the target language, the language that you're choosing to focus upon. If your aim was for the students to exchange opinions, agree and disagree, teach the phrases they need to do this, and then only correct errors they make with these specific phrases. If they use different phrases from the one that you've taught, which work just as well, then praise them and record the new phrases on the whiteboard. Most of the battle is the student's self-confidence to have a go. Now, by overcorrecting, you run the risk of stomping all over their motivation. Try and keep the experience positive for the learner. Being corrected constantly can be really demotivating, as every language learner knows. As you're listening out for your students' errors, make sure that you also listen out for really good uses of language. Highlight these to the group too. In the case of language learning, I really do believe the classic saying that you learn from your mistakes. The first port of call when correcting can be the students themselves. Students can often correct themselves when they realise that they've made a mistake. Sometimes the mistake is simply a slip, and they're aware of the correct version. Give the students a chance and time. Don't jump in and interrupt. Give them space to correct themselves. Don't do the thinking for them. Let the students do the work, often by just waiting and raising your eyebrows, or repeating the mistake. The students will know what you mean, and they'll backtrack and correct the error themselves. Some teachers create all sorts of hand signals to indicate the type of error. Pointing behind you is a classic to show students that they should have used the past tense. If these work for you and your students, go for it, and create your own correction indicators. Students can also correct one another. Peer correction often helps create a really positive class atmosphere, as students realise that you're not the only source of error correction, and they're in control. They can learn a lot from one another. Once the students have performed a conversation or a dialogue or a role play, don't be afraid to repeat it 2 times or 3 times. Give feedback on the first performance, maybe drill a few of the corrected errors as a class. Then run the whole thing again, and maybe again, correcting and giving feedback each time. You can split the class in half. Half the students perform the role play or the task, and the other half watch, but you must always give them a reason to watch. For example, they can tick off a list of the target language as they hear it. If the role play or dialogue is based on a list of phrases or vocabulary or grammar, the students watching can cross the words off a bingo card as they're listening. One way to focus on students' mistakes is to take a time out of an activity and look at mistakes as a group. When students are doing a speaking task in pairs or groups, monitor the students and listen in on what they're saying. Students will get used to you hovering around them. Although it's not your usual monitoring style, they may wonder what you're up to at first. But try to keep discreet and unobtrusive. Make a note of the mistakes that you hear, whether they're pronunciation, grammatical or lexical mistakes, and collect a selection of their errors, then stop the activity. Write a selection of the mistakes on the whiteboard and ask students to correct them in pairs or in groups. If students are working in pairs and you have a leftover student, why not assign them to the role of assistant teacher? They can have a notebook and a pen, and they can make notes of the mistakes they hear. If they do their job well, they could even run the correction slot. They could be the teacher. They can use their mistakes instead of the mistakes you heard. Usually, most of the mistakes can be corrected by the students themselves. Correcting mistakes the second they are made has the advantage that you don't have to bring the activity to a stop, as is the case with a correction slot. Students often appreciate instant correction. Think about what type of activity it is before deciding or not whether it's appropriate to correct on the spot. You don't want to destroy the flow of the task by butting in. Students can also be responsible for on-the-spot correction if they're encouraged to pick up on each other's mistakes. Always remind students that if they're constantly making new mistakes, it's okay. New mistakes are usually a sign that they're exploring new uses of language and experimenting with new vocabulary. But if they're always repeating the same mistakes, it's not such a good sign. By noting their mistakes, students have a record of their progress, and they can avoid repeating the same fossilized mistakes time and time again. It's a good idea to have a set space in their notebooks to write down their errors and the correct version. One way of doing this is to divide a page into 3 columns, like this. This is the end of part 1. Please watch part 2.